The book is Naked City, and the author and artist is Eric Drucker. This is the first time I've had a graphic novel on this particular podcast, even though I love the form, even obsess about it sometimes, and I couldn't ask for a better one to start out with. Welcome to the show, Eric, and thank you for joining me today.
Hey, thank you, Mark. It's nice to be here.
I have been an admirer of your work for a long time, so very excited about speaking to you today. Flood, way back when, was the first thing that I knowingly was exposed to by you. That was over 30 years ago that came out?
Something like that, yeah. That was my first graphic novel. We weren't really using that terminology then. I called it a novel in pictures was the subtitle. Graphic novel seems to be the label that's stuck over the years, and I'm okay with it. A lot of cartoonist friends of mine really don't like it. They're hung up for one reason or another. Sometimes it's legitimate, like Art Spiegelman. He doesn't like his Mouse being called a graphic novel because he says, well, it's not a novel. Right. A novel is a work of fiction. This really happened to me and my family, so please don't call it a novel. In my case, I don't mind. I like it. In fact, it's flattering to be called a novelist, and even though it's a series of pictures that I'm drawing, sequential art, really using the language of comics. But this latest one, Naked City, that just came out a few months ago, really is a novel. I mean, it's my longest form work yet, well over 300 pages, and it takes a while to get through it. You can't just sit down and you need to occasionally put in a bookmark and return to it like you would a novel, and it takes a while to get through it. So I'm definitely thinking of it as a novel, but it's also very much of a kind of getting back to my roots as a cartoonist. I'm using the full vocabulary of comics this time: word balloons, thought bubbles, captions, all of those tools that I wasn't really using with Flood or Blood Song, which were both silent. I was being very strict with the term graphic. They were purely graphic novels using purely graphic means to tell the story. I felt like I shouldn't have to resort to language, verbal language. It was also just an experiment to see how much of a story can I tell without resorting to using words at all. Can I just have a sequence of pictures telling the story? It hasn't been done recently. Graphic novels, woodcut novels, silent novels were in their heyday about a century ago, back in the 20s and 30s in Europe. It was the same time as silent movies. It was really a parallel history to that. Cinema, which was a new art form then, was all silent before sound came along and talkies came along. Of course, even silent movies weren't totally silent because they had captions. Every couple of minutes there would be a caption on the screen with words. I was refraining from using any words at all. But in this one, Naked City, I decided, okay, this time I'm going to use the full vocabulary. I already did the silent treatment, purely graphic treatment. And even in this book, there are passages where I don't use any words. There are chapters that are virtually silent. What I really was exploring in this book is the dialogue. Dialogue is something you can't really fake that without words. You could follow the action. You know, the character is walking down the stairs. He's outside. He's crossing the street, and oh look, it's raining. He's opening an umbrella. You could follow that, but you can't really substitute what he's saying or his delivery, his choice of words. You really need to use dialogue. And I figure, well, why not use a few word balloons here and there? They don't have to be in every single panel. Some panels could just be what the character is thinking, the thought bubble, or a caption. But one of the things that I love about the form of comics and graphic novels is that you can do, there are certain things you could do in this form that you can't really do in any other medium. That I mean, I'm curious to hear if you have any thoughts on this subject, Mark, as far as novels or even nonfiction or cinema for that matter. I always feel like movies are the ultimate art form because it's a composite. It's visual art. It's also theater. It's sound. It's music. I mean, it all goes into the mix. But even in movies, you can't really do what you could do very simply in a graphic novel, where you could have one of the characters talking to, you know, character A could be talking to character B. It could be the character's friend, or it could be a policeman talking to this character. But what they're saying in the word balloon directly contradicts what the thought bubble is saying. And you could have that in the very same panel, juxtaposed. He's saying this, but he's actually thinking this. This is really, and I feel like this is closer to the human experience. We're always thinking something, and what we say very rarely corresponds to what we, you know, how we actually feel. Even to ourselves, there's a discrepancy there. How we're feeling. Can we even articulate how we're feeling? So much of what we're feeling is nonverbal or incoherent emotions, and we're trying as best we can to articulate and persuade. Maybe the person, you know, depending on if it's a best friend or if it's a judge or a doctor or a policeman we're talking to. But what we're thinking during those moments is usually very different from what we're actually saying, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it was funny coming to this book because being familiar with your earlier work, particularly Flood and Bloodsong, I thought I knew what I was getting. And then I remember seeing some panels posted online, and it was like, well, words. It really kind of shook me because it's like Eric Drucker's doing words. That's something.
Yeah, it is, because I've kind of gotten a reputation over the years of being, you know, the strong silent type. He doesn't resort to words. Some English teacher in high school told him that good writing consists of just being, you know, very direct and terse. You should eliminate any unnecessary words, and you shouldn't have to resort to 3, 4, 5 syllable words. Look at Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, right? You should be able to communicate with 1 and 2 syllable words. So I took that all too seriously with eliminating the syllables. I said, well, how about no syllables at all? Here I am writing a book without any syllables at all. How's that?
You know, one thing that it strikes me that the use of language, and particularly dialogue, has going in this book is that in earlier books, inner character relations seem very physical, and that's here too, but there's an additional layer once people can actually speak to each other, and certainly your art style carries a lot of emotion with it, but it does Does this seem an accurate reading to you, that that language creates a difference in the relationship between characters?
Yes. It's quite fascinating because it's hard to even really put your finger on how it alters the communication or even the storytelling from panel to panel. I try to make the words something extra that you shouldn't really need the words or the captions to tell the story. That's always the high bar that I put for myself. It shouldn't depend on a lot of elaboration or what do they call it? What do writers call it? Expository writing,
Right.
Exposition. It shouldn't really require any captions. It's, show, don't tell, right? It's that whole bit. But I feel like I had done that for so long and had gotten so pure and carried away with it, where look, I'm showing, I'm not telling, I'm not using any words at all. I'm just getting as concrete as possible. You're just following the action. And I'm doing that in Naked City as well, but on top of that, the new layer that I put on top of it all is that some of the characters, when they speak to one another, there's a certain rhythm to the speech. And there are more characters in this book. In Flood and Bloodsong, there were really just a handful of characters. In fact, you were really just following this one solo character through Flood, who just happens to look a little bit like the author. And he encounters different people, but you're really following this one individual through this journey. And at the time I did that book, I realized that if you just as a narrative device, that the reader will automatically identify with the character if there's just really one character who we're following. The reader is going to naturally identify with that character, whatever the gender or ethnicity of the character is. We almost can't help but identify with the character we're following through a long, convoluted journey. Okay, but then what happens if you introduce a second protagonist or a third protagonist, and they're all interacting with each other, and it's not clear that one character is the hero. It's more of an ensemble of characters. What then? Who are we going to identify with then? And is that even something that I'm concerned with in this particular story about identifying with one or more of the characters? Actually, not so much. I sort of let that go. I wanted to have a deeper story that was really about relationships between people, at least the three-way, well, there's a couple of love triangles that unfold between the Isabel, the singer, the musician, and then there's the painter and the street dancer. And how does it go now? Isabel falls in love with Alex, the street dancer, a little bit too quickly, right? Can't help herself. Meanwhile, the painter is already obviously attracted to Isabel, who's less attracted to the painter. She's just showing up as a gig. It's her day job. She's unable to support herself with her art form, her music, at least in the first couple of chapters before she's discovered by a record label. But she realizes that she's just making some pocket change playing music on the streets and in subway platforms, and she's going to have to, in order to pay her rent, she's going to have to get herself some kind of day job. And after a series of these flunky jobs that we see her in, house cleaner, working in a fast food restaurant, McDonald's, your egg McMuffins, sir. Your chicken McNuggets, sir. And then she gets a job as a telemarketer for a couple of days before she's fired. She winds up in desperation looking through the want ads again and sees, just as she's feeling desperate and about to jump out the window at midnight, she notices that there's an ad for for art. It says model wanted, artists model wanted. Very cryptic. What does this mean? Is this like, am I going to be posing for an art class or what? And she calls the number, and the artist, quote unquote, on the other end is saying, oh, no, it's not an art class. It's just me. You'd be posing for me in my studio. So she proceeds very cautiously in that first chapter, and she arrives in Manhattan, and she notices that, okay, this is the building. It's on the top floor of this building. And on the way up in the elevator, she tells herself, okay, if anything feels at all off or weird, I split. Simple as that. But the painter turns out to be a fairly benign, non-threatening type. In fact, he turns out to be an actual painter. She steps into the studio and she sees all these other recent paintings. The canvases aren't even dry yet. He's clearly working really hard. He's the real deal. And he's paying her in cash just to pose for a few hours a day. So this becomes her day job for a period of time. And that's the first relationship, really, between the singer and the painter. The painter, who's a good bit older and he's more established. He's able to make a living from his artwork, where she's trying to pick his brain. How are you able to do it? How are you able to survive as an artist? She has so many questions for him.
And of course, there's a fourth character who remains mysterious for a lot of the book, the mysterious window washer that we see early on.
The window washer wielding the squeegee.
Mm-hmm.
The squeegee man, yes. He appears occasionally in the first chapter and the second chapter, but he's very peripheral. It's a surprise that he ends up becoming almost center stage. And that he's an artist of sorts himself. But it's not really until the final chapter or two that we learn about him and the significance of who he is. He's just a guy washing the windows in the background. But it turns out that he's got a lot to say. He's got a lot of perspective, and I suppose he's probably the oldest one in the story with the most varied life experience. And yes, he definitely has an angle on not just life and creativity, but the art, even the definition of art. What do we mean by it when we say art? That's a pretty loaded word. Art. I'm an artist. Oh, really? That's one of those words like love or God, It means something totally different to each individual. What exactly are we even referring to?
Well, I definitely want to unpack some of these themes that we've brought up so far, but I do want to talk a little bit more, since we're talking about art, about the visual style of this, because that was, in addition to the words, some of the visual approaches you take struck me as different from your earlier work as well, particularly when it came to the artist, who has a much more classic, cartoony look to him, with the bulbous nose and all. Not something I've really seen too much from you, so can you talk a little bit about your approach to designing the visual components of these characters?
Well, this book is definitely a departure from the last couple of graphic novels. I'm calling it a trilogy now with this one. It's the City Trilogy. Each one stands on its own completely as a story with a beginning, middle, and an end. But what they have in common is that they all wind up in Manhattan, where I was born and raised. And the city is almost a character in all three stories. But beyond that, it's not only a departure that I decided to use words and lots of word balloons, but to really lean into it, the comics medium. Again, using the full vocabulary of word balloons and thought bubbles. Along with that, I decided to make a couple of the characters really cartoony. Not all of them. In fact, the painter he's really the almost a throwback to an earlier era of newspaper cartoons. I mean, he's kind of an archetypal cartoon character, the way I draw him. And he's the comic relief. I mean, he's funny. He's tragic, but he's funny, the way Charlie Chaplin is tragic, that sad clown routine that's always so poignant. And so much of comedy, especially American comedy, seems to have evolved from. I think all comedy, though, is very close to tragedy. The two are always very kind of inextricably linked. But then the way that I draw Isabel, who's really the protagonist of the story, she's a little bit less cartoony. And in fact, her story is a lot more serious, the trajectory she's on. And when we finally come to her flashback at the end of chapter 1, we learn that, oh, she's really not just hitchhiking to the big city from the Midwest, but she's really running away from something. She's always, even now that she's arrived in the big city, she's always having to look over her shoulder. And she's extremely paranoid because her mother was from Mexico. Father was some Italian guy, American dude from the Midwest. But her mother was from Mexico. And one day when Isabel was about, 4 or 5 years old, there's a knock on her door. And her mother opens the door, and these men in strange uniforms speak to her mother and start asking her these questions. And her mother is trying to be very polite and answer as best she can in her broken English. But then without any further ado, these men put handcuffs on her mother and just take her away. And this is ICE, the ICE police, immigration, customs enforcement. I mean, I saw all of this coming a few years ago when I was working on the story. I saw that, there's this national hysteria blaming, scapegoating immigrants, not just in the U.S., but throughout Europe. I mean, this is what this whole growing nationalism and totalitarianism all has in common, whether you're in France, or Ireland or the U.S., where they're just going after immigrants. And of course, they're not really fooling anyone. It's kind of overt racism, because they're not going after Irish immigrants or French immigrants. They're just going after brown-skinned immigrants. So there's that. So I decided, to me, this is, having grown up in New York City, where it's just a city of immigrants. And I was very close to my great-grandparents who immigrated from Eastern Europe back at the turn of the 20th century, that is, from Bohemia and Lithuania, Czechoslovakia, places like this. And then all of my friends growing up were either Italian or Irish or Puerto Rican. I was lucky in that regard, that I got to have various Puerto Rican girlfriends and Cuban girlfriend and Caribbean girlfriends, because that's what New York is. It's a very Caribbean city. So these are all themes that I'm just weaving right into the story. I mean, it's not the center of it, but it's going on very much in the background of Isabel's story, the protagonist. She's always running scared. that the police or the Customs Enforcement or Department of Homeland Security is coming after her, no matter how. She could never outrun them. She could hitchhike to New York, even when she's becoming successful as a musician in New York, and records an album, and she starts performing in places like Radio City Music Hall. It seems like the more fame she gets, the more paranoid she gets, because she has the secret that that her mother was illegal. But does that make her illegal? It's not clear. As far as she knows, she was born in the US. But as it's become clear just in the last couple of weeks here in the US, even that's been called into question.